Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to today's luncheon event at the Rumi Forum. I'm Tariq Shafi. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Stuart Schwartzstein, who is a policy analyst and an independent consultant based here in Washington, D.C. Most of you will recall that Stuart Schwartzstein gave us a talk here at the Rumi Forum in November '08, and the title of his talk then was Future of the Middle East with Obama Presidency, Hopes and Challenges. The title of his talk today is The Obama Administration's Foreign Policy, Is It What Was Expected? And it would be interesting to hear your views, Stuart, about some of the developments, both good and bad, that have happened during this interval. Mr. Schwartzstein has worked as a foreign affairs professional for more than 30 years in the Defense and State Departments, including as service as a diplomat, an analyst, negotiator, advisor, and planner. He has held positions in several think tanks, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and he has served in many think tanks also, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also based in Washington, D.C. While at this center, he did a good deal of work on Iraq issues, particularly focusing on human rights violations by Saddam Hussein and his regime. More recently, in 2004, he worked in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad as an advisor to the Minister of Science and Technology and to the President of the Iraqi National Academy of Sciences. Stuart, welcome again to the Rumi Forum.
Thank you.
Back in November '08, you and I talked about the expectations of the new Obama presidency. We were trying to get used to calling then Senator Obama President-elect Obama. Now that he is, say, 70 plus days into his presidency, how would you rate him? How, from a scale of, say, 1 to 10, 1 being pretty bad, 10 being fantastic, grade him and tell us the reason for your grade.
Well, I think, first of all, I think in a way it's unfair to grade at this stage because we're only fewer than 3 months into the presidency. And that means that while cabinet appointments have been made, a lot of sub-cabinet appointments have yet to be made or confirmed. And it's a combination of not just cabinet appointments and policies from the White House, but sub-cabinet appointees and others who implement those policies. And really, to understand how successful a policy is, you essentially have to try it. It's like trying to judge a recipe before something's actually been made. That said, I think President Obama has got off to a very good start. In a number of ways. I mean, if I had to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I think I would give it at least an 8, possibly a 9. Yes, there have been some mistakes, but then that's inevitable for any number of reasons. Some of which is simply that not all the information that's salient is always available. There are some of the missteps with respect to some appointees, simply apparently the information wasn't available, or quite simply hadn't, for one reason or another, been recognized. However, when it's come to foreign policy, I think there's been a good deal of care, and I think the appointments thus far have been excellent. I think it was a wise decision to keep Secretary Gates for a number of reasons, including the fact that he is a thoughtful man. I think the choice of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State was an inspired choice. I think, too, that the appointment of George Mitchell as mediator for Israel-Palestine was an excellent choice. And Dick Holbrooke for Pakistan-Afghanistan, also an excellent choice. So in some of those, appointments, I think we've got off to a very good start. There are also some other appointments less well known. Anne Marie Slaughter, formerly of the Wilson School at Princeton, is now the Director of Policy Planning at State. She's very bright, has written extremely well on a number of subjects. And so I think little by little we will see how these appointees and the policies being put into effect are having an effect. But let me make a couple of prefatory points first. I think that, and the first is that I think we all recognize that the world breathed a sigh of relief when the Bush administration ended. It was disliked, detested, and justifiably, in my view, vilified in many parts of the world for arrogance, unilateralism, and what appeared to many around the world as a lack of respect for others. I think that was particularly damaging to us in the Middle East, for example, where we simply, under the Bush administration, the U.S. did not convey a sense of respect for many. I think quite simply the replacement of the Bush administration by an administration with an entirely different approach, different tone, has been greeted with enthusiasm and a good deal of hope. That's been helpful, and that's helped make for what we might call something of a honeymoon. But while President Obama has that advantage of a honeymoon, the U.S. and his administration will be judged by policies and performances over the longer term. And that's already started. Now, another thing that I think we need to bear in mind is that the current economic crisis is both the worst in this country since the Great Depression and is global in scope and is very serious. I mean, as I speak, President Obama is en route to London for an economic summit, an extraordinary economic summit of 20 countries. But the entire world has felt already and will continue to feel the effects of this economic crisis, which in many respects is unprecedented because never have we had such a deep recession since the world's economies have become so interlocked and and economies so globalized as a result of any number of things, particularly the information revolution. But I think we can expect certain things. One of which is that this crisis has changed the image of the United States to a degree. Now, this is not something that the Obama administration has brought about, but quite simply, the view that some in this country particularly like to indicate is that the U.S. as an economic role model, that image has been tarnished quite a bit. After all, the subprime loan problem originated in this country, and the failure of large financial institutions and companies, AIG, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, the problems of major banks, of Washington Mutual, problems of Bank of America, Citigroup. These are enormous institutions. And of course, General Motors, which for so many years was, if you will, an icon of American industry. I think it was the president of General Motors many years ago, I think it was Charlie Wilson, who said something to the effect of what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. It's a change not only in image, but the idea that some have that the U.S. ought to play the leadership role in the world is becoming, you might say, somewhat unstuck. After all, again, much of the crisis originated in this country. But I think, too, what we may see is not just a restructuring of the economy in this country to some degree and greater regulation in certain areas, but we may also see emerging from this restructuring in any number of other areas in the world. And I think it's too soon to say exactly what will happen. But we also know that the role of the United States politically and militarily also rests on a sound economy. And to the degree that the U.S. economy is able to sustain a role, we will have to see. But there are a lot of dynamics that are in play right now. We simply don't know yet, I think, how things are going to emerge, and as we all hope, the recession, we will get ourselves out of this recession in the not too distant future.
Stuart, one point, if I may. This dynamic of our losing our political international clout in the world was put forward by the Chinese premier or the finance minister recently.
That's right.
Who said that perhaps we need another reserve currency. And Geithner seemed to agree with him, and then he had to back away.
Because there have been any number of shifts. Remember the Bretton Woods Agreement, it was negotiated 60 years ago. And the institutions that were brought into existence and the agreements are in a number of respects outdated, and changes need to be made. A number of countries, China certainly in 1944 was not the China of 2009. And I think little by little we will see increasing demands for a more multipolar approach, not just broadly politically, but reflected in institutions like the IMF. So, I mean, we will see certain kinds of restructuring. Now, one of the other things, and the Economic Summit in London today is illustrative of the recognition that the solutions to the economic problems we have right now cannot be made by any one country. Now, there are differing views. Angela Merkel has views that are somewhat different from President Obama's, not surprisingly. Different kind of economy, different politics, different needs. The Europeans overall have a different situation. They have a far more extensive safety net for individuals than we have in this country, all of which, but nonetheless, I think it's recognized by this administration that considerable cooperation is critical. And I think it's recognized by other leaders as well. Now,
is the shift seismic as far as the U.S. is concerned? A lot of us, economists here, philosophers, thinkers, political analysts, are very concerned that the American model is now being modeled towards the European model, and that is un-American almost.
Well, I mean, my own sense is that to call something un-American is akin to talking of something being unnatural and essentially meaningless. What is necessary is what will work. What will work for this country, for the people of this country, as well as we hope for others around the world. The Europeans have had certain solutions to problems that are admirable. We have had certain solutions to problems that are admirable. The Europeans have borrowed from us. We've borrowed from Europeans. Of course, Europe is not a monolith by any means. And just as within this country, there are significant differences between approaches of different states and so on and so forth. But no, I think when some commentators, usually on the right, say, that's a European approach, that's terrible. That's not a thoughtful way of approaching these things. And one of the hallmarks of the Obama administration, which I think is wholly admirable, is a rather pragmatic approach. And that's what's needed. We all saw how a highly ideological approach in many ways was a disaster. And I think President Obama's top priority is getting us out of this economic crisis, and he will do what he sees as necessary based on advice from any number of quarters. And I think that's another thing, and it's not just in the area of foreign policy, but in the economic area, that he wants to hear a variety of views and then think through what are the best approaches, as well as, of course, what he has to do is what's politically feasible. That's part of a pragmatic approach. Now, as backdrop as well, though, I mean, there are any number of other problems in addition to the economic crisis that still have to be dealt with, even though, and I think it's an important thing to remember, that the economic crisis has, if you will, captivated the White House to an extent. I mean, sucked the oxygen out of any number of other issues because that has got to be the top priority for a number of reasons. Not just the role of the United States in the world, but quite simply politically. The American public expects that to be the top priority.
Well, it's a pocketbook issue.
That's right. And the campaign was largely along issues of who could best deal with the economy.
Right, and he said himself that he'd be judged in 4 years.
Absolutely.
On how he performs at the economy.
And that's true. I mean, and part of that also is, I mean, generally speaking, Americans are not terribly aware of what goes on outside the borders of the United States. That's another factor too. I mean, just as the State Department has essentially no constituency, because there is not, if you will, great concern on the part of the average American as to how American diplomacy is conducted or what goes on in distant places. I mean, the percentage of Americans who really, you might say, care seriously about what goes on in Uruguay or Chile or Burundi or Kyrgyzstan, is small, you might say. Even the percentage of Americans who care what's going on in countries like India, China, and Brazil is still small. So, I mean, the political reality is that it's got to take a top priority. But the other problems won't go away simply because attention is being paid to the economy, and they have to be dealt with. And very clearly, and I think one of the fortunate things about having elected President Obama is that he's very smart. He is able to deal with any number of issues, but at the same time, he's also willing to delegate, and he's shown that ability thus far, which is important. The fourth point I want to make in preface to some of this is that we should expect the unexpected. I think every administration has events that are unexpected, crises that are unexpected, things that will alter the political calculations or sometimes force a change in policies. Sometimes events also have the ability to force an administration to actually think through a policy. I remember, and one of the things that I remember in the State Department that I found amusing was that if someone died, a head of state or someone very prominent in another country, now when someone dies, there's a funeral. Now, if this is a state funeral, then of course somebody at a very senior level would be sent to the state funeral. And on such occasions, what happens, of course, is that there are, on the periphery, meetings. Bilateral meetings. That is, the Secretary of State, if he goes, will meet with other foreign ministers. Well, all right, so funeral means bilaterals. Bilaterals mean preparation for those with briefing points and so on and so forth. And those occasions then do also result in a need, since you're putting it down on paper, then in thinking through what are our policies, what are our priorities with respect to that other country. And events can propel that sort of thing as well. Not everything is planned. Funerals are not always planned.
Normally, attending funerals was one of the main duties of a vice president.
Right.
Now I think vice presidents have a lot more power than they used to.
Right. The days of John Nance Garter, who described the vice presidency as not worth a bucket of spittle.
That's right. Those days are long gone.
Right. But again, let me say the administration is only in its third month. And we are seeing that focus on the economy, but we're also seeing, as indicated in the campaign, a strong interest in and efforts to extricate the U.S. from Iraq. And that's an important goal. We're also seeing now an attempt to devise policies which have broad international support for Afghanistan. And Secretary Clinton is now in The Hague, meeting with the representatives of 79 other countries. The conference is to find ways in which to deal with Afghanistan, and that there too, that symbolizes something of a departure, because that kind of multilateral approach is not something that we saw in the 8 years previous. But it's a very sound approach, because we know that we can't do it alone in Afghanistan. Not only can't, but it's not wise to either. A broad coalition is both in terms of treasure. Well, it's not just a matter of money. In terms of resources and political support is critical.
Stuart, one point here. Yesterday I read in the Wall Street Journal that former CIA Director Deutsch wrote a piece saying that we should lower our sights from Afghanistan and concentrate a lot more on the neighbor, Pakistan, especially along this Afghan-Pakistan border where the Taliban resides. And he said that we do not have a vital interest in Afghanistan, but the stability of Pakistan is truly essential. And he made the point that that is so because Pakistan is a nuclear power, with all the difficulties that would entail, with India being the partner on the east side. And if Afghanistan remains a medieval country, then so be it. We cannot afford to have Pakistan go down this route.
Well, I think he's absolutely right about that. But what we also saw was that an Afghanistan controlled by the Taliban was also an Afghanistan that harbored al-Qaeda and others, and did pose not just a regional danger, but then, as we saw on 9/11, dangers elsewhere. There are differing views on how to deal with Afghanistan and the extent to which resources should be put into it. Many point out that any number of attempts over a few millennia to conquer Afghanistan have all been futile.
Ask the British.
Right, and the Soviets.
And the Soviets.
But Pakistan's importance is great for any number of reasons. It's not just nuclear capabilities, but a large population. It's an important country, and the subcontinent itself, with a massive, very high percentage of the world's population, it can't be ignored. But dealing with, how to deal with Afghanistan and Pakistan is a very tough question. There's quite a few. Dick Holbrooke is very bright, and I worked with him some years ago. He's extremely bright, and he's tenacious. I think he was a very good appointment for that really challenging task. But it's not clear that this country can alter things significantly. There's no way the U.S. can remake Pakistan. And also, as I think of it, I think that at times there are a number of Pakistans, because the contrast, and we've talked about this, the contrast between an elite that includes a number of highly sophisticated, well-traveled people in big cities, places like Karachi, and yet in the Northwest Territories, in the Swat Valley, and a number of other places, there are many people who are, in worldview, essentially medieval, hardly educated, many totally uneducated. Certainly, in certain areas, education for women is non-existent. and there's considerable poverty. So there are extremes in Pakistan. Also, we know that the intelligence services are divided. There are different views in the military. There are there are some significant differences in political views. And of course, there's a good deal of religious extremism, a certain percentage of the population, and at the same time coexisting with a number of Pakistanis who are essentially secular.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a recipe for stability.
No.
And that is of great concern. But we shouldn't harbor any illusions that we can either control the country or remake the country. We can possibly provide kinds of assistance that will help stabilize things, but I think that's an open question.
Stuart, one final point on Pakistan, then you can move on. And this is going to be, I guess, a challenging question, maybe unfair. But how would you define what people call a failed state, and whether Pakistan is in that category or quickly drifting into that category?
Well, I think failed state is not a term that has ever been used with any precision. You might call a failed state one that no longer exists, like Somalia. I mean, there is no central government of a Somalia.
I see.
It's been broken up, essentially. And of course, as with terms like failure and success, it depends on how you define those. Now, one of the hallmarks, though, of a successful government, central government, is its ability to control, extend its authority throughout the country. Mm-hmm. In that sense, I think we'd have to say that the government in Islamabad is not able to do that. But then there are any number of countries around the world where the writ of the central government doesn't apply. And this has been the case in any number of countries around the world for a very long time. And any number of countries well, for example, let's take one that's been in the news, Sudan. Now, Khartoum does not control the entire country for any number, and there are any number of conflicts within Sudan. And any number of other African countries, too. The government may have control over certain things, certain resources, the currency, but doesn't really have complete control over the country. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, of course, it's a question of how you define control, too. But I'd be wary of terms like failed state. But it is a serious problem in Pakistan that the central government doesn't have control, is also not seen as, you might say, it's not even seen as legitimate in certain quarters. I mean, that's been one of the big problems with Iraq. Bringing about a central government that is seen as legitimate by all major factions and given the authority to perform the functions normally expected of a government throughout the country. And that's, again, I go back to Iraq, that is happening slowly, but it's not by any means certain that a central government of the sort that we envisage or that we have here is really going to emerge. So, but one of the other, to go back to other themes, I believe that the Obama administration will increase emphasis, I mean, has already, in maintaining and strengthening alliances of all sorts. Again, that's a departure from a unilateral approach and a recognition that you simply can't dictate terms to everybody. And then in the same way, greater reliance on international organizations, significantly greater respect for the United Nations, for example. The appointment of Susan Rice to a position that John Bolton had held shows a significant change in attitude. And one of the other things is mending fences, an important function, if you will, mending fences, particularly in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Now, a president whose middle name is Hussein is, to a degree, simply going to be seen as someone somewhat sympathetic, but also he's lived in a Muslim country. I think he's the only president we've ever had with any Muslim connections. And I think he recognizes, I mean, by both, for reasons of both his education, his intelligence, and his own experiences, that an approach that might be seen as a, if you will, crusader approach can only be counterproductive. So, I mean, that I think is changing things. I think there's also recognition of the need to keep relations with China friendly, on an even keel, and to work cooperatively. Now, go off a little bit, Secretary Clinton in her trip to China was not critical, openly critical, of the Chinese for human rights, which upset a number of people in this country. But if we contrast that to the visit to China early in the Clinton administration made by Warren Christopher, where prior to his visit to China, he was in Australia and talked openly of the need for human rights in China. And then when he landed in Beijing, I think it was at the airport, he said the same sort of thing. And he got, not surprisingly, a cool reception. The Chinese, he was, in effect, embarrassing them. And that's not a way of making gains in an area, no matter how deeply you feel about human rights. So I think there's going to be a cautious approach and a carefully considered approach in dealings with China, which, of course, is an extremely important relationship. There is also, of course, a desire to improve relations with Russia. And though there had been a mistranslation, I think the Russians have the idea, and there have been other exchanges between, remember Secretary Clinton's reset.
Oh, yes.
The reset button.
Yeah.
But I mean, there have been exchanges between President Obama and President Medvedev, and I think very clearly the administration wants to get off to a very good start with Russia and come to agreement in any number of areas for mutual benefit and recognition that there are going to be Russian interests that will not coincide with ours. But we need to work these things out carefully.
Stuart, may I ask you to comment briefly on our relationship or developing relationship with Iran? Recently, President Obama spoke to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Was it just a change in terminology? Did it have a meaning? Was he speaking to the mullahs or the citizens? Or
well, I think he was speaking to the entire population.
What was he saying? What was his message?
Well, essentially is that we bear no animus, that the United States is not an enemy, it does not want to be an enemy. It was also a departure from some of the older policies that had been of taking out, if you will, the regime in Iran, and an indication that we are interested in mending to the degree possible the relationship.
Some took it as coddling to the mullahs.
Well, any kind of overture is going to be seen by some, but the fact is that Iran is there. It's got a government, and it needs to be dealt with. I thought one of the great mistakes of the Bush administration was in 2003 just ignoring, blowing off the Iranian approach to us. There is, I think, legitimate concern over Iran developing nuclear weapons, and that I think is not just a matter of Iran, but there would likely be something of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Do we want to see a Middle East that is with nuclear weaponry? So there are a lot of issues with Iran, but I think that was a good opening approach and an indication even though some of the Iranian leadership denounced President Obama, nonetheless, I think the message would have been received. And we also shouldn't forget that there is a certain liking, if you will, for Americans overall on the part of the Iranian public. After 9/11, there were demonstrations in Tehran in sympathy for the U.S. So there is that to consider. But it's a tough situation in a variety of ways because very clearly the Iranian government does have, if you will, some territorial designs. The statement by someone senior in the Iranian government the other day to the effect that Bahrain should be part of Iran, has made for some problems. It makes it even more difficult given that there is a Shia majority in Bahrain that's somewhat oppressed and a Sunni monarchy, sometimes described as a constitutional monarchy because there is a constitution, even though it's been suspended, and it's a monarchy. But there is an undercurrent of serious conflict there. The Iranians have also laid claim to some islands in the Straits of Hormuz, and then there are other tensions. I mean, obviously, Iranian influence in Iraq is strong, particularly in certain parts. There are, as we know, Kurds in Iran, as well as in Turkey and Syria. And so what the Kurds in Iraq do is watched carefully by Iran. And then, of course, the Iranian-Syrian Hezbollah connection is yet another element. And that's complicated, too. I mean, the degree to which Iran has taken that kind of position, particularly anti-Israel position, may well have been calculated more to attract certain Arab support despite some old Arab-Persian antipathies. So that is complex. Now, the one of the things that I think is of interest too is that for all the rhetoric over the years of how important Turkey is to the U.S., we are now going to see a presidential visit in a few days, and I think that's something that should be welcomed. Any number of other things, that have been going on that we've seen set in motion. Rethinking of Cuba policy, long overdue. I think there's going to be considerable rethinking about how we deal with Israel and Palestine. Dealings with Syria, that's already underway. Rethinking there. Rethinking of the drug problem and drug cartels, the recognition that it's demand that is also an important part of the problem. The French reintegration into NATO, I think, has been brought about by simply the Obama presidency and a different set of attitudes. And certainly things like closing the Guantanamo, or the intent to close Guantanamo and denunciation of torture, are also important. So I think we're seeing the beginnings of a number of changes that I think will be extremely helpful to this country's place and ability to affect events around the world.
Wonderful. Well, Stuart, at this moment, I think we just have about a minute or so left. One final question I will ask, then we'll wrap up for some questions and answers. Vice President Cheney has been doing a little bit of a tit for tat with Mr. Obama, saying that his policies somehow have created a lack of security for the homeland. How does that help the young president? And does President Obama have the responsibility to reply in kind?
No, I don't think there's any. I don't think former vice president's statements deserve any response. I think they're motivated for two reasons. First, should something actually happen And despite all the measures that have been taken, that are being taken, nothing's 100%. Something could happen. But then that would give Cheney the opportunity to say something along the lines of, well, I told you so. That's one aspect. The other is it's a kind of political sniping from the sidelines.
The loyal opposition.
Yeah, but perhaps as importantly, it's an attempt to justify the kinds of policies that he advocated in the White House, illegal though they may have been.
All right then. Thank you very much. We'll open the mic for the audience. Some question and answer. Mr. Ali.
Ali Yurtsever with Rumi Forum. How would you envision the visit of Obama to Turkey? It's going to be the almost first visit to a foreign country.
Well, I haven't followed that closely, but my sense is this. First of all, I think there's going to be reassurances of the interest of the United States in a strong relationship with Turkey. Recognition that there are any number of problems in areas close to Turkey that are quite legitimately of Turkish concern, and perhaps, and I have no idea, I've not seen anything internal. I mean, I believe that the Turkish mediation between the Israelis and the Syrians is something to be commended highly. And I can only suspect, as I said, that President Obama would say a number of good things about that as well. And part of it is also, of course, some of the message that he wants, that we do not have an anti-Muslim approach. And if you remember at his inauguration, in addition to mentioning Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, he mentioned Muslim. Mm-hmm. So it's an approach to say, it's also saying, look, we want to approach things as fairly as possible. We want strong relations with Turkey, the rest of the Muslim world, and we will listen to you, and we have considerable respect. But as I said, there may be other details, but I have not followed it closely, and I certainly have no access to any of the internal documents that.
Any other questions? Yes, this lady at the back. Could you please stand up and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Dina Gergis. I'm with Voices for a Democratic Egypt. My question pertains to your thoughts on the Obama administration's policy towards democracy promotion in the Middle East. You were saying basically that this idea of sort of being invested in strengthening alliances, and that when prior visits of administration officials to China, when they raised the issue of human rights, that was not useful in terms of making inroads. As you know, Secretary Clinton was in Egypt recently, and she was very severely criticized by the Washington Post in the aftermath for also making sort of underplaying the practice of promoting human rights by saying that the Mubaraks are her close friends, and that we write human rights reports about various countries, and that had very little to do with U.S.-Egyptian bilateral relations. In 2005, when Condoleezza...
Can you make it quick, please?
Okay. Well, basically, so I'm asking, I guess my question, the bottom line is, alliances with who? Are you speaking of alliances with governments or alliances with the people? Because in the context of the Arab world, those are two very different things. And sometimes alliances with governments come at the expense of U.S. strategic interests in the long run. Thanks.
Well, there are any number of different elements that have to be considered into devising any policy. But first of all, alliances cannot be made with people, except through governments. Now, there are times when an alliance may be strained because of a government's dealings with its own people. Now, to get to the problem, the issue of democracy and human rights in countries like Egypt, it's something of a conundrum for a variety of reasons, because one of the dangers is of course a collapse of government, if you will, which might result in conditions that are worse. Stability is an important issue, and again also the economy. the collapse of a government is likely to have an adverse effect on a country's economy, a severe effect, impoverishing people. There are trade-offs. There are always going to be trade-offs, and it's extremely difficult. I think at this stage, the Obama administration is in effect saying, look, we're not going to depart from certain values, but we're not going to rock the boat very much right now. We want to deal with a lot of this as quietly as possible. And there may also be something of a if you will, a Kennan-esque approach, saying that we do better leading by example than simply using rhetoric. One thing that must be avoided, I believe, and I think is appreciated by this administration, that lecturing, a condescending approach, a patronizing approach, doesn't work. You know, in effect saying, oh, we know how a government ought to work, how a democracy ought to work, but you don't, and let's teach you. No, that doesn't work.
We have a question at the back.
Ms. Amin, one last question. Taking you further east again, Korea. That's the one hot spot I don't think you've mentioned.
South or north?
North. Well, either. But if you want to look at the peninsula, but I would say north.
That's as any number of administrations have found, going back to the 1950s, it's an extremely difficult country to deal with. And the problem now that North Korea has gone nuclear is all the more aggravated. Again, it's not a problem that the U.S. can deal with unilaterally. And it's not clear that even multilaterally it can be dealt with, because there's a certain, you might even say, capriciousness on the part of the North Korean regime. Though it does seem that its highest priority is simply to stay in existence. But negotiating with the North Koreans over the last decades, as you probably know, have frequently resulted in serious frustrations. So
we have a question at the back.
Hi, thanks for the speech. My name is Tolga Aksoy, and my question is this. I guess we are all share the excitement about Obama's new foreign policy after 8 years of the Bush policy. And my question is this: are you sharing my feeling about Iran, which is, America can look to the cooperation points, especially about the war to the drug cartel in Afghanistan, because Iranian government is spending billions of dollars, or millions of dollars, millions of dollars to fight with the drug trafficking through Afghanistan and through Iran. Then the cooperation points in Israeli-Palestine issues. I don't know if I make myself clear, but
well, I think I think it is recognized that cooperation with Iran in a number of areas is important. We had excellent cooperation with Iran in 2001 when we first went into Afghanistan. And there are a certain number of issues in which we've got mutual concerns and no difference in essentially in policy. One of the important things in diplomacy is finding those things where there are points of agreement and then moving on to those issues of contention and seeing where both sides can work things out to mutual advantage. Long, tough process. I don't see, given many differences with Iran, that anything can happen miraculously, or if you will, overnight. But I think a term that President Obama used in his press conference, was it last week, was a week ago, was persistence. And a certain amount of persistence, hard work, and thinking through, I think progress can be made.
All right. Thank you, Stuart, very much for coming and talking to us again.